All right, we're here with Dr. J.J. Hannigan from San Jose State University, assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology. J.J., why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you did school at?
Sure. So I started out getting my bachelor's degree in exercise science and master's in athletic training from St. Louis University. And then I continued, while I was doing my athletic training degree, I got very interested in biomechanics and running related injuries. So I decided to keep going in school. I did my PhD at University of Oregon, which is where I met Robert, or Dr. Wayner. I was doing my dissertation work on some risk factors for patellofemoral pain. Then I stayed in the state of Oregon, did a postdoc at Oregon State University Cascades, where I still was focusing on running injuries, but started to focus more on maximal running shoes. And after 2 years of that postdoc, that's when I started my position here at San Jose State in the Department of Kinesiology.
Okay, so that's kind of what we wanted to talk about. So your work at Oregon State University, your postdoc, that's when you got into looking at maximal shoes, and specifically how maximal shoes differ from traditional shoes or differ from minimal shoes. Give us an overview. Tell us what you did at Oregon State, how you got into, how you got into looking at maximal shoes, and then how did you look at the effects of maximal shoes on running biomechanics?
Sure. So the answer of how we got into maximal shoes is pretty simple. My postdoc advisor, Dr. Collard, had already searched natural fit for me to come in and help do that work in the lab. So at this time, do you want me to start sharing my slides and go over those studies that we did?
Sure, let's do it.
All right. All right, and can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. So at Oregon State Cascades, we did a series of 3 research studies to date that have been published, looking at the effects of maximal running shoes on running biomechanics. And there's no exact definition of what a maximal shoe is. Right now, we're just loosely defining it as significantly greater cushioning throughout the midsole compared to a traditional shoe. And generally, these shoes also have a little bit less heel-to-toe drop than a traditional shoe. A lot of maximal shoes have about 44 millimeters of heel-to-toe drop. So Hoka One One is one of them, probably the brand that really started this maximal shoe craze. And so for our first 2 studies, we simply went to our local running shoe store and asked, what's the most popular maximal shoe? They said it was the Hoka Bondi. And so for the first 2 studies, we looked at the Hoka Bondi shoe and compared it to one of the most often worn traditional shoes, which is the New Balance 880. And for our first study, without knowing much about what we were going to find, we had a very simple question. And that was simply, are we going to see any differences in some ground reaction force parameters between shoes? And we also did look at eversion a bit in this study. So for this study, we recruited 15 recreational runners to the lab. They did 2 bouts of running for 2 separate visits. So during the first visit, they were randomized to either wear the traditional New Balance shoe or the maximal Hoka shoe. And they ran overground in the lab both before and after doing a 5K on the treadmill. And the purpose of that 5K on the treadmill was simply to provide a short acclimation period to those shoes. So again, they came in for 1 visit, wore one or the other shoe, ran over ground, 5K on the treadmill, over ground again while we collected biomechanics. And you can see here's just a picture of the 2 shoes, the Hoka Bondi and the New Balance 880. And our hypothesis at the time was due to the fact that these Hoka shoes had a greater amount of cushioning, that they would lower the impact peak and loading rate during running. If you're unfamiliar, here's what a normal ground reaction force curve looks like during running if you're a rear foot striker. So we have time on the x-axis, vertical ground reaction force on the y-axis, which is generally normalized by body weight. Generally, we have this usually smaller peak that occurs during the first about 20% of stance phase. It's called the impact peak. Then we have the active peak, and the loading rates is defined as the slope of the line during the middle 60% from initial contact to impact peak. And that represents essentially how rapidly the runner is loading that limb. So for the loading rates, we actually found it was exactly opposite of what our hypothesis was, that the loading rate was significantly higher in the maximal shoe. So we have the maximal shoe here in orange, the traditional in gray. And both before and after the 5K, there was no effect of that acclimation period. We saw the loading rate was higher in the maximal shoe, as well as the impact peak was also higher in the maximal shoe at both time points compared to the traditional shoe. And both of these factors, there has been some studies that have correlated these factors to an increased risk of injury. Particularly with the loading rate, there was a meta-analysis done that correlated that to an increased risk of developing a stress fracture. So having, again, higher loading rates or impact peaks, we don't think is necessarily great. For the active peak, which hasn't been as associated with injury risk, we did not see any differences between shoes or any effective time. We did also look at eversion mechanics for the shoe. We didn't find any differences in peak eversion between shoes. So to summarize this first study, there were elevated impact forces and loading rates in the maximal shoe, which could increase the risk of injury. And these factors were not mitigated after a brief acclimation period. And if you'd like to read this study, this was published in the Orthopedic Journal of Sports Medicine a couple of years ago. So after we did that study, we had a lot of questions that arose. The biggest question was, if we give runners a longer acclimation period, so instead of just running a 5K in the lab, if they're able to really train with the shoe over a period of what we did 6 weeks, will we see some of these factors that were elevated in the maximal shoe come back down to where the traditional shoe was? So our question was, will runners adapt to mitigate these higher impact forces and loading rates if given a longer acclimation period? So for this study, we had about almost double the number of runners. We recruited 28 recreational runners. They also came to the lab twice. This time it was 6 weeks apart. And this time during both visits, they wore both the traditional and the maximal shoe, which were the same as from the previous study, the Hoka Bondi and the New Balance 880. So during each visit, the order of shoes was randomized, so they might be wearing either the New Balance or the Hoka first. And then again, they'd run overground in our lab while we collected biomechanical data, both kinematics and ground reaction forces. They then were given these shoes. They were asked to gradually increase their mileage, the percent of mileage they were running in these shoes over a period of 6 weeks. So they were not changing anything about their training regime in terms of total mileage, whatever they were doing before they were asked to keep doing. The only thing that was changing is the amount of mileage that was run in the Hoka shoe. So for the first week, we said try to get about 20%, second week 40, then 60, 80, and then the last 2 weeks try to run about 100% of their miles in the maximal shoe. And our hypothesis was after 6 weeks, we thought that the impact peak and loading rate would significantly decrease and no longer be significantly different compared to the traditional shoe. Unfortunately, like our first study, we found our hypothesis to be incorrect. This graph may look like the graph from our first study, but I assure you it's different. So the loading rates were also higher in this study in the maximal shoe versus the traditional shoe. And we saw not only for the loading rate, but for every single variable, both kinematic and kinetic that we looked at, there was no effective time. So after acclimating to the shoe for 6 weeks, nothing biomechanically changed, at least none of the measures that we looked at did we see a change. So the loading rate was still significantly higher at both time points. The impact peak was still significantly higher at both time points. And we saw no significant differences in the active peak between shoes or time points. We did take a closer look at eversion kinematics for this study. So again, for our first study, we took a really brief look. We found that peak eversion was not different. And again, in this study, we found that peak eversion was not different. But in this study, we decided to compare and look at the entire eversion curve. And we actually did find some problematic findings with the maximal shoe. So if you're looking at this curve, first of all, we have percent stance phase on the x-axis. We have eversion is negative, inversion is positive. On the maximal shoe is in the solid line. The traditional is in the dotted line. So even when they first strike the ground, runners are trending more towards being everted in the maximal shoe. They're almost at a neutral position. And even though peak eversion is about the same, you can see in the traditional shoe that by about 80% of stance phase on average, and this is an average curve for all participants, you can see that they are re-inverting, which is what you would expect to see. But in the maximal shoe, they are staying everted for almost the entirety of stance phase. And there's been some work done by Jim Becker, who's at Montana State, on prolonged eversion. And he found that in runners with medial tibial stress syndrome and runners that have Achilles tendinopathy, they display prolonged eversion. And part of the reason we think the prolonged eversion is bad, or the way of saying it is being still everted at toe off is bad, is because if you're trying to push off and your foot is still everted, that mid-tarsal joint isn't locked. It's not as solid as a lever at the foot, and it likely increases the strain on a lot of muscles and other soft tissue in that area. And you can just do this at home right now. If you just roll your ankle in and you try to do a little single leg hop, versus if you lock your ankle in a regular position, it's going to feel different, and it's going to feel worse if your foot's everted. And very interestingly in this study, so again, we did a 6-week acclimation period. We had 3 runners that dropped out of the study. One was due to blisters, but we had 2 that dropped out due to what looked like injury. One described symptoms that mimicked Achilles tendinopathy, and one described symptoms of shin pain. So it's interesting that previous work had shown or suggested that prolonged eversion was a risk factor for developing Achilles tendinopathy and medial tibial stress syndrome. And then we had 2 runners that dropped out due to Achilles pain and shin pain. And when we looked at these 2 runners' biomechanics, they displayed significantly prolonged eversion. So it's not published right now, but we're actually writing those findings up right now for publication. But to summarize this study, again, a 6-week transition did not change biomechanics. We still saw elevated impact forces, loading rates, and this time we saw prolonged eversion in the maximal shoe. And all 3 of these risk factors have been associated with risk of injury. Again, we can't necessarily say that runners are at an increased risk, but these risk factors have been shown to be problematic in previous research. And this paper was published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine about a year ago. For our 3rd study then, the question that we had is, well, one of the limitations of our first 2 studies was that we're comparing 2 different brands of shoes that vary not just in the amount of cushioning, but other parameters. The hardness or stiffness of the midsole may be different. The shape of that midsole is different. So we wanted to know if we more tightly control the shoes that we're looking at so that the only difference is the actual amount of cushioning, do we still see the same findings? So we took a shoe that was available at the time on the market, the New Balance Fresh Foam Boracay. And New Balance was able to custom design 2 other shoes based on the Fresh Foam Boracay. So they were just took that shoe and custom made a minimal shoe where they took away a lot of that cushioning, and then they created a maximal shoe where they added cushioning to the shoe. But everything else about the shoe was the same. Then again, we had the similar study set up. This time we knew that at least after 6 weeks, we didn't see any differences. So we just had them come into the lab one time. They wore the 3 shoes in a random order. We collected their biomechanics during running in our lab running over ground. So now we're comparing 3 different shoes. First, looking at the ground reaction forces. So here we have the traditional shoe in blue, the maximal shoe in orange, and the minimal shoe in gray. So if we're just now looking at the traditional and the maximal shoe, we did not see any differences this time in the loading rates between the traditional and maximal shoe. And I'll pull it up as well. We also did not see any differences in the impact peak. The one difference that we did see is that the loading rate was significantly higher in the minimal shoe, which does make sense based on some previous literature that showed that if you're a rear foot striker and you go from wearing a traditional shoe to a minimal shoe, generally the loading rate does increase if you maintain that rear foot strike, which all but 3 of our runners did. So we did see an increase in the loading rate in the minimal shoe. But if we're just looking at the differences between traditional and maximal, there were none. So this, again, was against what our hypothesis was, because we thought we'd find the same findings as our first 2 studies. But we did find that was the same is that in the maximal shoe, they still displayed prolonged eversion. So same setup of the graph, percent stance phase on the x-axis, eversion is negative on the y, inversion is positive. The blue line here is the traditional shoe, green is maximal, and red is minimal. And you can see that all shoes at initial contact are pretty close. They're pretty clustered together. A little bit more spread out at 50% of stance phase. So we do see a little bit more peaky version of the maximal shoe than the minimal, which is more than the traditional. But where we really see differences, where these error curves stop overlapping, is once we get to about 70 to 80% of stance phase. And then we can see in both the traditional and the minimal shoe, again, the shoe re-inverts before push off, but in the maximal shoe, we are still everted before push off. So again, same thing that we found in the second study. We saw that runners are still everted for the majority of stance. Again, for so to summarize, after directly manipulating the cushioning, we didn't see any differences in impact forces or loading rates between the maximal and traditional shoe. And we have a few hypotheses as of why. One is that this is more just based on our touch. We don't have any data, but the Hoka shoe, I think, has a little bit of a softer midsole than the New Balance shoe. And there's been some previous work in traditionally cushioned shoes that the hardness or softness of the midsole might play a factor. And those studies showed that if you have a bit of a softer midsole, you see a higher loading rate. So that could be possibly, maybe we were seeing these differences before, not because of the amount of cushioning, but because of the softness of the cushioning. The other big thing you'll notice if you look at the shoes from the side is that the Hoka shoe has what we call this rocker shoe design. It's actually, they call it their meta rocker. So we see that the heel has a curve. It's a little bit off the ground, and especially also in the forefoot. Whereas in the New Balance shoe, that heel is really flat on the ground, and we see a less pronounced rocker in the forefoot. So it could be possible too that the construction or the shape of that midsole, maybe that's also affecting our results. We're not sure. But we did still see runners displaying prolonged eversion of the maximal shoe, possibly just because if you're a little bit higher off the ground, their foot and ankle is just a little bit more unstable, and it's harder for them to re-invert prior to toe off. But again, we don't know exactly for sure why that's happening. This study was just published very early on in 2020. So the overall findings from these 3 studies, so we did see greater impact forces and loading rates in the Hoka maximal shoe, but not all maximal shoes. But we did see consistently that runners had prolonged eversion in all maximal shoes. So we think that the specific construction of the maximal shoe plays a significant role. So we can't, I think a big takeaway from these studies is that all maximal shoes are not going to be the same. You're not going to find what we found if you compare maximal shoes, especially across different brands. So a few ideas for future studies. One is that we'd like to compare different types of maximal shoes. So taking a shoe with the same amount of cushioning, but a different hardness of that cushioning, or a different shape, having a rockered versus unrockered bottom. Another thing we'd like to compare is looking at runners who habitually wear maximal shoes, because all of our runners in the studies that we did had never worn a maximal shoe before. But there's a lot of runners in our community that, whether it's a Hoka shoe or another Maximal shoe, have found really good success with them. They find it very comfortable. I've talked to several runners who have said, I used to not be able to run, more than 5K without having knee pain. And now I put on the Hoka shoes and I can run 10K or further and I feel fine. So what's happening with those runners? Are they displaying more adaptive biomechanics? Why are they liking these shoes when biomechanically we're so far not finding anything that would be injury protective? And then finally, the big overall goal is to eventually do a longitudinal study, either a cohort study or even a randomized control trial where we have runners are either wearing a Maximal shoe or a traditional shoe over a period of maybe a year, and to compare injury rates between those two groups of runners. So that's
awesome.
The studies that we've done to date. We have, again, some future work, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Actually, you kind of talked about a lot of stuff there in the end, but like one of the things that, like, the question I keep coming up is you're getting towards the, your final study where, okay, now we take out the fact that we're comparing a Maximal shoe that's from one brand, from one, company, when their approach to building a shoe, designing a shoe, the materials they use, when compared to another company which uses a completely different approach, and say, okay, these are the differences between Maximal and Minimal. So we go to a study where, okay, now it's the same shoe. We got a Minimal, we have a Maximal, we got what would be considered traditional right in the middle, and we built that out. And like you said, you found different results when it came to the first two studies, like loading rates up, average loading rates up, instantaneous loading rates up. But now we've got the flip. And you kind of pointed to, okay, this is why we think it was different. It might be the softer midsole, it might be the design. How do you think the softer midsole in the Hoka, how do you think that contributes, or why do you think that encourages a higher rate of loading?
So, we're not particularly sure. One theory is that because not only are they higher off the ground, but if that midsole is a little bit softer, runners might actually want to hit the ground harder because they're lacking that stability or that proprioceptive feedback from the ground. So if you're landing on just think about landing on a foam pad versus landing on hard ground. You might actually land a little bit harder on the foam pad because you're already expecting that to be a softer surface and you're trying to find that stability. So that could be part of the reason why. There's another study that did show that in different types of cushioned shoes, so having a more cushioned shoe actually changes joint stiffness as well. So having a stiffer ankle or a stiffer knee joint at landing could also contribute possibly to those findings. And it may all be tied together. So again, we don't know for sure, but it might just be, again, due to runners trying to get that ground feel back or trying to get that stability that they don't have as much of if it's a higher, softer shoe.
Yeah. Or it sounds even just like they're increasing their stiffness response to the lack of stiffness in the shoe, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Shoes more cushioned. The stiffness that is taken from the midsole is out. So now we're increasing stiffness. I feel like I equate it to, or think about, like, in some of the studies that have looked at like people transitioning over from like firm surface to soft surfaces and looking at the changes in mechanics as they go through that transition. And like when you have individuals who go onto a soft surface immediately off of a hard or firm surface, stiffness goes up, center of mass oscillation goes down, joint excursion goes down, and the same type of things, like impact goes up, and those factors go up as they transition. And then when they go over, like, they're responding to their surface, right? Like they're more compliant when they're on a harder surface, they're more stiff on a softer surface. Do you think that's a little bit to it with this type of shoe?
Yeah, I think you might have nailed it with that description. I think that's certainly possible. The interesting thing again, though, is you would think, you said, initially when that happens, that's what you find. You would think that over a period of 6 weeks, once they kind of get used to, having a softer shoe, they might be able to modulate how they're landing on the ground in terms of their loading rates and their initial impact force, but they did it. So, we still don't know if for sure if that's happening or if it's something else we're not considering.
Yeah. And this is probably opening up like a whole can of worms, but do you think that's similar to what they found like initially with like the Roger Cram and Hukamer at Colorado when they looked at the Vaporfly? Like, again, there's the material properties of the shoe that they looked at. They looked at obviously the physiologic changes, but down there in the line items for all the biomechanical changes, they found very similar results to what you found in your first two studies, right? That loading rate went up, right? Initial or peak force went up, all those factors. Do you think that's a similar response in those because of similar, like again, a more absorptive, cushioned shoe or component?
It could be, and especially with these new racing shoes, I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on. I think their work has been really insightful, looking at the effect of that carbon fiber plate on ankle mechanics, how it changes that internal sagittal plane ankle moments, and then that proprietary new cushioning, how it has increased compliance and resilience. But it's like you said, it's the why that it's really hard to pin down the why part of it, and we can make our best guess based on the data. But at this time, I don't think we can say for sure. Yeah,
and only just because of just looking at it now, like, and you talking about it, in your last study with the New Balance shoes, right? They're all the same. All the heel to toe drop, right? That it was consistent, right? Like whether it was the minimal or the maximal shoe, it was all like about like a 4 millimeter drop or something like that. Was that the same in the other studies? And could that also affect?
A good point. It was not. So the Hoka has a 4 millimeter drop, and I believe the New Balance shoe, I think, had a 12.
Okay.
And so part of, again, that's a big part of the reason we wanted to standardize it more. One of the big reasons we picked those two shoes is we simply came in with the mentality of let's pick the most popular maximal shoe right now, which is the Hoka Bondi, and then let's pick one of the most popular traditional shoes right now, which one of them was the New Balance 880. So, we're just looking at two of the most popular shoes, but again, yeah, you're right. They vary in a lot of different factors, except for just cushioning. So we definitely can't say that it's, especially based on the results of the third study, we can't say that it's just cushioning. That's the difference.
Yeah. On the other side, the thing that you found was the kinematic changes, the changes in pronation and eversion or eversion timing. Why do you think you kind of said a little bit, okay, we think it might be different because they might be a little bit higher off the ground. Why do you think that consistently shows up, whether it was the Hoka and your New Balance?
Yeah.
New Balance. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, we're not entirely sure. I think the fact that they're higher off the ground, especially in the Hoka shoe, we think it's a little bit of a softer midsole. It might just be a little bit harder to re-invert if you're on an unstable surface, whether that's, again, a combination due to height or, again, just because the midsole's softer, it might be a little more difficult to re-invert prior to toe off. So that's one possible reason. Another possible reason could be more due to the overall construction of that shoe. One thing I didn't talk about is that the Hoka shoe has just a little bit of a wider, slightly flared midsole, whereas the traditional shoe and then the New Balance shoe we looked at doesn't have a little bit of a flare if you look at it from behind. So whether that's that small little design, whether that could be also playing a factor is possible. But again, with the New Balance shoe, we still saw the same thing. So yeah, we're not entirely sure, but it could. Our leading hypothesis is just because it's a less stable surface, it's harder to reinvert.
Okay. Um, so if you're looking at your results, and like if I'm if I'm looking at putting somebody in a shoe, or someone's looking at picking out a shoe, like what do you take away from what your findings are, and how do you use that to say, like, if I'm interested in a maximal shoe, should I be in it or should I not be in it? Like, who would this be good for? Who would it not be good for?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions that we want to answer with one of our future studies, because anecdotally, there's a lot of runners out there that have had great success with maximal shoes, even with the Hoka Bondi specifically. So, and we don't know biomechanically if they're doing anything different from the runners that participated in our study. Again, we didn't really quantify this, but from our 6-week study, I'd say that around a third of the runners hated the shoes, or maybe probably even a little over a third of the runners. Maybe a little less than a third were kind of, it's okay. Maybe I'll wear it again a little bit. And then about a third of the runners liked the shoe, at least enough that they said they were going to keep wearing it for their training. So and we didn't specifically compare because we didn't really record. It was just talking to them after the study. So, are those runners that are liking the shoe, or do they look different? Do they, are their ground reaction force parameters different? What are they doing? So we're not sure why some runners respond to the shoe better than other runners. So as of right now, the best advice is to try the shoe on, which I know is, I don't know when people will be listening to this. Right now we're in a pandemic. It's hard to go to a shoe store and try shoes on. But that's really the best advice is some of the best evidence we have right now. The injuries of run simply pick the most comfortable, which seems overly simplistic. So best recommendation is to, if you can, try the shoe on, run around a little bit in it. Does it feel good? Do you like wearing the shoe? Does it, how does it feel on your joints? If it feels good, give it a try. And if it doesn't, maybe try going with something else until we have a little bit more data on the types of runners that we might recommend this shoe for compared to others.
Okay. Nice. Just because I'm interested, I think back, so it's going back to the studies a little bit, but did you just observe any other, obviously you have going into the study, this is the things we're most interested in. Does it change these factors that are associated with injury? Foot mechanics, forces. But did you notice, did they change anything else, or is there anything else that you saw across the board in individuals, like once they got into maximal shoe or once they were into different levels? Like, was there anything else that was jumping out that they changed?
Yeah, there wasn't. We didn't do an exhaustive search, but we looked at a few other of the common factors. So we looked at, hip adduction, hip internal rotation, knee varus valgus. There was no difference there between any of the shoes. We looked at some joint moments. We didn't see anything different that might suggest an increased injury risk. So of everything we looked at, what we reported were our main findings. We didn't see anything else that looked problematic.
Okay. And then I got to come back to this topic again, but obviously from a performance perspective, right? That's what we're seeing now. Like when we look at all these super shoes, for lack of a better term, but like whether it's Nike's Vaporfly, Alpha Fly, their whole list, but you've also got Brooks has their Hyperion Elite, Saucony has their Endorphin Pro, Hoka has actually their own, like their Carbon X. Yeah. So like how do those shoes fit into all this? Because by the general definition that we have of maximal shoes, they'd fall into maximal shoes, right? They have the lightweight of the racing, but they have the increased stack height, increased midsole cushioning that a maximal shoe would have. How do they fit into all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we are So I had a grad student who is actually doing a project on the Nike Vaporfly Next Percent right now, and we collected biomechanics on 12 competitive distance runners in the Nike Next Percent shoe, comparing it to a minimal New Balance shoe. And one of the things we were interested in is because we found, for example, we want to look at eversion mechanics because we, in our maximal shoe studies, are finding prolonged eversion. And if you have runners that are training in these shoes and running in them for 26.2 miles, if you found that could be something, that's worth noting. And we're still working on the data. We're still writing it up, but preliminary results suggest that at least there wasn't any differences in. We didn't see prolonged eversion, at least we with the results we've looked at so far. So whether it's a carbon fiber plate or the difference in foam, the problematic eversion mechanics that we were seeing in the maximal training shoes, we at least didn't find those in the Next Percent shoe, with, again, the caveat that this is very preliminary data. We're still looking at some of the ground reaction force parameters, so I can't comment right now if we saw any differences there. But overall, as of right now, again, we also looked at the hip, the knee. We didn't see anything different there. So as of right now, we haven't found anything different in terms of injury perspective for these shoes. Now, for performance, it does look like it changes the sagittal plane, ankle kinematics, and kinetics, which might be part of the reason why we see this performance increase. So we were seeing similar results initially in our study that Hukamer saw in his study regarding that plantar flexion moment. But I probably don't want to get too far into that until we finish with that data analysis.
Yeah, that sounds good. What are some of the challenges that you found with studying footwear to this point?
I mean, one of the hardest things is kind of what we talked about is being able to control the study. Because if you're trying to compare two different types of shoes, no matter what, even if it's the same brand, they're all different. And so in order to really tightly control these parameters, you have to get a custom-made shoe, and it's not easy to just, call up a company and have them make a shoe for you. So that's one of the biggest challenges is especially now that we're getting into this phase of our research where we do want to more tightly control things, we'll be trying to get shoes where we can answer the research questions that we want to answer.
Yeah. Cool. What else have you found with working with shoes, or what else do you think is kind of next, especially like when we look at answering the questions on how do we minimize injury risk, or how do we both create a shoe that meets the runner's goals of performance or just healthy training, but keep them from getting injured?
Yeah. At least in my mind. So there's a few more basic questions that I want to answer about the shoes. For example, teasing out the hardness, softness issue, or the rocker design issue. I also want to look at the difference between someone who wears and has had success with a maximal shoe versus those that have never tried a maximal shoe. But for me, that's leading up to a bigger longitudinal study where we simply look at injury rates comparing maximal traditional shoes. And there's a lot of complexity with that, of what maximal shoe do you want to study? Do you want to study one or many? How do you design that? And that's probably a few years off, but that's going to get more at, and that's kind of how the minimal shoe studies progressed, as well as you answer some of these more specific questions, but eventually you want to do a bigger study where you're looking at injury rates between a minimal and a traditional shoe. And I think we want to get there with maximal shoe research as well, and really try to figure out that hopefully the shoe companies will appreciate too is how can we change our maximal shoe design so that, runners that love a maximal shoe, I mean, they're not going away. Runners that, there's always going to be a market for them, but how can these shoes be designed to minimize risk of injury? And there's still a lot of questions to be answered in that regard.
Yeah. Or even just seeing, like you said before, like you have a lot of people in the area, like we have a lot of people in the area here who love their maximal shoes. I mean, I think if I went and asked our local running store what their highest sellers or some of their most popular brands, like Hoka's going to be up there. So you obviously have a big following, and a lot of individual, a lot of people who really like that shoe is, for the people who love it, mechanically, what do they look like?
Yeah.
What do they look like in the shoe versus a traditional shoe, or what do they look like versus the people who don't like them, when they get into them and they like their more, traditional, lower stack height shoe. That'll be interesting. You kind of said and this maybe like the last question I have, but if you look at it longitudinally, obviously you talked about the prolonged pronation, the prolonged eversion, the increased time in eversion. And then the people in your study who dropped were, medial shin and Achilles. Do you think that's the type of injuries that I should say, what type of injuries do you think we'll see? I think if you go back to the minimal, if you looked at minimal and traditional, right, they didn't find necessarily a difference in injuries, but the type of injuries were different, where we saw more knee injuries in and around the traditional shoes and more Achilles and foot injuries, and, lower limb injuries in the minimal shoe. Do you think that maximal shoes will have a consistent response where it's if someone's going to get injured, we might see more of these lower limb injuries, or do you think it'll be just kind of a mixed bag?
Possibly. So if this finding of prolonged eversion is prevalent in a lot of maximal shoes, and again, I wouldn't be surprised to see more Achilles and shin injuries. And if you look at the findings again regarding loading rates, it wouldn't shock me if we saw an increase in stress fracture incidents. Anecdotally, a lot of runners say their knees feel better in these shoes. We didn't really find any big differences at the knee. We're not exactly sure what's going on. So if I were to guess, I would trend more towards the injuries I mentioned, but everyone is different. Everyone's going to react differently to the shoe. So I say 100% for sure anything.
Nice. Well, awesome, JJ. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for going over it. And I hope that you continue to be able to answer some of those questions and get some of the kind of longitudinal studies that you're looking for. And, we'd be obviously happy to follow up and see how it's going.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. This is fun.